Okay, we should be good. Hey, Aaron, we are
All
live
right.
right now. Hey, I
All
feel pretty good
right.
about this, huh?
Yeah, getting the ball rolling here.
Absolutely, and we should start seeing people pouring in from the audience. Thanks to everybody for your patience with a little bit of a delay right there. Just needed to make sure that all the guests kind of knew where to go. Congratulations for joining us. This is the very first Disability in Central Texas LinkedIn Live event that we are doing. And I'm Myles, I'm with Peak Performers.
And I'm Aaron Bangor. I'm with Disability in Central Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really excited to talk with you all today. So this is something that's really near and dear to my personal heart. I don't know about you, Aaron, but so oftentimes people with disabilities can feel excluded from the hiring process. So in this one, we actually have a very frank conversation with the businesses about why you should hire people with disabilities, but then also how you can better go about doing so. This is meant to be a very practical, kind of pragmatic guide for you to kind of help give you a little bit of idea of how to get started. And spoiler alert, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but you already have people with disabilities working for you, but they may struggle a little bit throughout the recruiting and hiring process. So we want to give you the tips of the trade to be able to help better enable you to do better and be better about the disability recruiting process. And the other thing too is that there are so many people with disabilities out there, and there are so many companies that are looking to hire. Hopefully this can be an impetus for you to really be able to find more people to get the job done that you need to be done. So Aaron, would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about who the heck Disability In is, and also like Disability in Central Texas? Explain that for me.
Sure. Well, first of all, I kind of wear a few hats, so I just want to make sure people are aware. So my day job is with AT&T. I'm a principal user experience researcher. And so I work with the business to try to understand how to make things more user-friendly, and that includes making sure that products and services and digital platforms and things are accessible and usable by the full range of potential people that might come to do that. But one of the other hats I wear is chair of Disability in Central Texas, and we're an affiliate of Disability In, which is a business-to-business organization dedicated to disability inclusion. And I mean that term very broadly. So at Disability In, like talk about inclusion covering the workplace, the supply chain, the marketplace, and the accessibility of those things. So today we're going to focus mostly on that first one, the workplace, and specifically the foundation of an inclusive workplace really is ensuring that your staff reflect the communities that your organization serves. And as you put in one of the teasers on LinkedIn there, 26% of the U.S. population has some type of disability. So yes, organizations of any size are going to have people with disabilities working for them. The question is, do they feel like they can bring their full self to work? And
this is actually the first in a series of events that we're going to be doing all throughout the entire year. So every second Thursday of every single month, we're going to be doing an event, and we're going to be alternating between doing in-person and virtual. So this is our first virtual event, but I hope that you're going to join us next month on the second Thursday of the month at 11:30. We're going to be meeting at Easy Tiger, and we're going to be talking about ERGs, which is something that, frankly, I don't actually know a lot about. So I think that I'm going to be really valuing a lot of the other people that are coming and participating right there as well, too. So don't forget, there will be invitations that are going out probably a little bit later this week or early next. But please do join us for that event, especially if you are in Austin, Texas, because we'd love to network with you in person.
Myles, I'll kind of send it back to you, and can you start us off with why hiring people with disabilities isn't just a feel-good story that a company should be putting can put in their advertising, but that
Absolutely.
It's really good for the business and what that business is trying to accomplish.
Well, hey, and that's the good news about it, right? Is that it's not only it makes you feel better, it's not only protecting your future job, but it's good for business too. So this is actually a report that recently came out from Disability In and Accenture, and what they found was that there is a total of 17 million people across the United States that are prime working age that have a disability. So that's a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of them that don't have a job. There's a lot of people that develop disabilities a little bit later in life. There's a lot of people that might be denied their very first opportunity to get a job, but for various different reasons, there's many people that are automatically kind of excluded from the workplace. However, companies that do prioritize disability hiring, what they typically see is 1.6 times the annual revenue. They also see 2.6 times the annual income, and they also see, basically they see kind of better numbers all the way around. This even goes kind of so far as to look at your Google reviews. The companies that prioritize disability hiring actually get better Google reviews as well. So, that seems like a lot of stuff, and that seems like very high level, but let's talk about exactly how they came about those answers. And what it kind of boils down to is that they do a survey of hundreds of companies every single year, and then each year, this last time, they actually selected about 30% of them to be what they call disability inclusion champions. And those people that were disability inclusion champions, they saw those numbers. They saw not only better retention, they saw better productivity, they saw better profitability, but then also they saw that every single metric of a positive business was better. So this really just kind of goes to show you that this just makes business sense. So I think the next thing that we need to do is we need to talk about how can we adjust the mindset. And this is something that when we were having our conversation the other day, it kind of struck me just how much I kind of live in my own personal bubble where I'm always thinking about disability hiring, but I realize that sometimes the words disability and hiring aren't always synonymous with each other, right?
Yeah, it's important to take a step back. There's a lot of people like in this space, but it's also something that we want to make sure that we're inviting everybody that is part of the overall ecosystem for hiring to think about this. And some people, probably more comfortable and more knowledgeable and have more context than others. I just want to take a step back, and when we talk about employment and jobs and things like that, the word disability traditionally is used for the situation in which you can't work. Right, so you have disability insurance, so that if you can't work, that you're covered during that time, or Social Security disability insurance is what you might get if you are no longer able to work or you're out of work temporarily. And so, in some ways, whether consciously or unconsciously, when the word disability comes up in the context of hiring and jobs and employment, for some that might be an oxymoron. No, wait a minute. Why are we talking about hiring when disability is that condition where you can't work? So let's take a step back and think about this a little bit more broadly. So, of course, that is disability, and not that word's been ingrained for a long time in the employment context, and we're probably not going to change that anytime soon. However, also keep in mind at the same time that disability is a protected class of people, and that disability is part of their identity and who they are, and we all have sort of a unique combination of capabilities and limitations, right? And that forms who we are, and disability is just one part of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't work, you can't do any specific job. Maybe some jobs and not others, but you're still able to work productively. It's about finding that match with the right business. So as we think about disability, yes, it has a sort of historical meaning, but what is also at that same time, it is about the identity of people with disabilities and what they potentially can do for the business. And we really need to think about both of those ideas of disability. It's the same word, but they mean two different things. And we need the focus today, and what we want people to think about in terms of hiring is disability is not can't work, disability is can work. Disability is a wide range of folks, and they can bring unique perspectives and talents to your organization. And what we want to do is not use that first definition of disability as an upfront barrier or just a way of filtering out people that can be great for your organization. So just let's acknowledge that dichotomy. Let's think about it.
It's important.
Let's make sure we're focusing on how do we go about making sure that one doesn't automatically preclude us thinking about the next one. So kind of with that, Myles, I'll kind of turn over to you, and maybe you can talk about what are some steps that businesses can take really to begin shifting that mindset away from disability is can't to disability is can, disability is value, disability is a great asset to add to your organization.
Let's kind of going back to what Aaron said is like, how can we start at a really high level and think about this from like, hey, what are some of the different systemic things that are in place? And the first thing that I would point out is that 90% of companies have a diversity, equity, inclusion statement, but only 4% specifically include disability as part of it. So that's very, very small. And for that matter, I think that it's important to call out any kind of marginalized group of people within your DE&I statement. But let's start at a very high level, and let's kind of make sure that everybody within the organization kind of has a groundwork understanding of like who we're trying to include within the organization. I think it's also important to acknowledge too that this is going to come as a bit of a shock for people. This is going to come as a bit of a learn for many people. So realize that this is not going to happen overnight. You can't magically kind of flip a switch and then all of a sudden you are disability inclusive in your hiring. This is going to take many conversations with many managers, many on-site folks, as well as the people in the C-suite within the organization. So you have to be having these conversations constantly, consistently, and with all the people on a regular basis. This is not a quick fix kind of thing. And then finally, I think that it's really important that we talk about maybe what are some of those systemic kind of challenges that exist within the system that we don't even realize that we're excluding people with disabilities. So there's a couple things that I want to call out. People with disabilities, they may struggle to get their first job, they may struggle to just get their next job, or they may struggle to get promoted. And that's here at Peak Performers, we see that all the time. People with disabilities experiencing a range of different challenges to entering or advancing within the workplace. But that said, there are a couple of things that we see, and these are very common things that recruiters are regularly taught to screen people out on. And so those the two most common ones are resume gaps. You often are told if you are in a recruiting capacity, like, hey, approach people that have resume gaps with caution, right? Because you may not know, maybe they've been sitting on the couch for the last 2 years doing nothing, or maybe they've just been doing whatever. But we really have to really rethink that mindset and think about why those career gaps might be happening. They may be happening because somebody developed cancer and they had to take care of themselves. They might be happening because, say for example, somebody had a mental health crisis. They had to get checked in somewhere, and then they are now kind of finally ready to re-enter the work world. But career gaps, they really, really kind of consistently sabotage people in being able to re-enter the workforce for a couple of different reasons. One, recruiters might rush to the assumption that they've been lazy, they haven't been doing anything. But the second reason is that recruiters might rush to the assumption that, oh, they haven't been keeping their skills sharp, and so therefore they're not going to be able to do the job. Really, when it comes to disability, it's all about kind of reframing the ability and the assumptions that we're making. But I want to talk about a second pattern that I see on resumes pretty consistently that your recruiting team can make an adjustment to right now. And the second thing is the perceived job hoppers in the world. So, Aaron, I don't know if you wouldn't mind talking about, like, how common is invisible disabilities, would you say?
So the estimates vary quite widely, but roughly I'd say about 2/3 of folks with disabilities, they are not apparent, right? So not through that person trying to hide it and so forth, but the nature of disability is that sometimes the disability itself is visible, or the assistive technologies that you might use, such as wheelchair or crutches or a white cane or a service dog, may be more visible than other disabilities.
Yeah,
you mentioned cancer as being one of those, but and mental health being another one. But a lot of times, even things like hearing loss is not immediately apparent to folks. So. Part of what you were going back to at the beginning, which is, hey, you may have people with disabilities working in your office right next to you, and you may not know that. That may not be something that is relevant to the job and may not be obvious, but at the same time, it may also be, have you created a culture in that organization that gives people sort of that feeling of safety to be able to disclose, yes, this is part of who I am, and I feel like I'm able to share that with my coworkers and with the organization, depending on the nature and culture that's been engendered by the folks around you and the leadership team and the broader organization more broadly.
And case in point, I'm a person with a largely invisible disability. I have hearing loss, and you can see the hearing aids, but you have to be standing pretty awkwardly close to me to be able to actually tell that. But yes, it's estimated that most people with disabilities have an invisible condition, and that's where we see job hopping come into play, right? So somebody comes and they show up for the first day of the work, and they realize that they need an accommodation, but they feel awkward about asking for one. Or they find themselves in a situation where they ask for one, but it gets so entangled in the process, or that it never actually happens in a timely manner, or maybe the employer kind of shirks their duties with kind of addressing that and taking care of that altogether. We can talk a lot about accommodations and kind of like how to reframe, and we will talk about how to reframe accommodations a little bit later. But these people, they get to an organization, they find that they are not included, they find that they cannot ask for what they need to be successful, and furthermore, they may feel stigmatized in the workplace, especially if there are coworkers that speak negatively about mental health disorders or people that have chronic health conditions, right? And what they do is they hop around between different jobs. They spend 3 months here, 6 months here, they spend a year here, they're back to 3 months over here. And as recruiters, we are taught from the very foundational level, like, hey, avoid these people. You want to be careful about these people, because a lot of times what's to say that they're going to stick around with my organization any longer? But we need to go back to the biases and the assumptions that we're making and really think about that, about why these things are happening and how can we restructure our systems and just the assumptions that we're making. But I want to kind of shift gears a little bit too, because when we're talking about organizational mindset, Aaron, you told me the other day that actually a lot of the shifting has been happening from DE&I, and for those people that are not familiar with that acronym, that stands for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and we're actually shifting now towards DEIA, or Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility. I know that's a mouthful, but would you break that down for me a little bit more?
Yeah, and just to confuse it even more, sometimes the A is anti-racism. So things can get a little confusing, and I think, rather than focus on the alphabet soup, let's focus on like why that. Certainly, the diversity, equity, inclusion is really focused on different aspects of making sure that an organization is really creating a culture that embraces our differences and sees the business value of those differences. And one of the things that the federal government did a few years ago was add A to that, which is accessibility, which is the specific designing of both physical and digital spaces to be inclusive of people with disabilities and various access needs associated with that. And the reason they did that was it goes part and parcel, right? So with, it's great to say that you have a disability inclusive culture, but if you have steps to your front door and no ramp, all the words in the world is not going to change those steps into a ramp just by good intentions, right? To paraphrase a great disability advocate once upon a time. So, we need to think about that and particularly bring folks in. And I like to talk about accessibility in three realms, right? That physical accessibility, making sure our physical spaces are open and inclusive to a range of folks with disabilities. Yes, that starts with ramps, but it extends to lots of other things. And just beyond ADA compliance, right? Are you using that physical space to make sure it's more inclusive of folks with a range of disabilities.
Yeah.
The digital space, and this has gotten more and more attention, obviously, I would say over the past 10 or 15 years, but really gained attention during the pandemic when so much of the things we were doing were both in the work world, but in our own personal worlds were mediated by digital technologies. And we realized that so many things have been built without accessibility in mind. There's an organization, WebAIM, out at Utah State University that scans websites, and they generally find about somewhere around 96-97% of websites have accessibility barriers, just from doing an automated scan, never mind actually looking more closely and does an actual human encounter barriers, which is usually going to be a higher burden. And then the third area, accessibility, just attitudinal barriers, right? Are we, as we thinking about creating spaces within the organizational management of organizations, the culture we want to create, are we throwing up barriers, a lot of times unwittingly? And so one of the things we want to do is kind of help educate folks about how we can address all three of those areas of accessibility to complement the overall DEI approach that an organization has.
Love it.
The interesting thing about accessibility is that it's not just about ideas and attitudes and how you want to create kind of that interpersonal space in an organization. You have to implement tangible change. You actually have to physically build the space in a different way to make it accessible. You actually have to implement features and functionality in digital properties to make them accessible. But the really neat thing about that is those tangible changes are tangible proof of an organization's commitment to accessibility. When you put closed captions on your video on your recruiting site, that signals that we're thinking more broadly than just if you can hear this video, that's the only people that we're interested in. And there's a universal aspect to that as well. Just as we know curb cuts out in the physical world make spaces more universally usable and accessible for everybody, right? Not just people who use wheelchairs, but people who push strollers or pull luggage or are using hand carts to make deliveries and things like that. Things like closed captions is an accessibility feature, but we know that actually most people watch video. I think there was a study last year that 90% of people were watching video on their streaming services. I think it was a Netflix study with that on. And there's research that has found that students learn better when they're consuming video with closed captions on it, even if they don't need the captions specifically because of a disability. So it is a way to not only increase inclusion, but also a way to demonstrate the steps you're taking and communicate to your potential job candidates, the people that are interested in, like, should I go to apply to this business or this business? Well, this business seems to have its act together and really want as many potential candidates to come through that door as possible. And that probably gives them a pretty good idea that if I do get hired or if I do get offered that job, that's an organization that is interested in taking care of everybody, not just kind of a narrow view of who their candidate should be. So,
love it. Well,
it's a great way to shift, begin shifting the mindset of, taking tangible steps, but really driving a culture, right? Which is, sometimes the hardest thing to do. That's why we started talking about it first, right?
And so let's assume now that a company is 100% behind it. They have committed and they've said, yes, I want to hire more people with disabilities. So I want to actually shift gears right now and talk about growing a referral network, right? So real quick, Aaron, what are kind of your perspectives on what does the referral network look like for people with disabilities?
Well, I'll first start by saying I'm a researcher, not a hire, but I'll start with one thing and then I'll kind of turn it over to you that I think is important, which is actively engaging with organizations outside of your own. right? So it's, you know, and this is really a tenet we have within Disability In, which is none of us have all the answers. None of us have ever done it perfectly, will ever do things perfectly, but collectively we're a lot smarter. We've had a lot more experiences, a lot of lessons learned, you know, sometimes the hard way, sometimes just good experiences as we go through that. So certainly starting with an organization like Disability In, which as I mentioned is business to business, right? These are other businesses that are somewhere along the disability inclusion journey. You know, no matter where you are on that journey, you have some sort of not only a question to ask because you want to know more, you want to get better, whether you're just starting or you've been doing this a lot of years. But at the same time, even if you're just starting, without even realizing, you probably have some experiences to share because everybody goes down a slightly different path. Every organization goes down a slightly different path, and what we want to do with Disability In is create a place where we can come in and share with each other in a space that, because we all are in organizations of different sizes and things like that, but we have that perspective of of what does it take to actually drive change in an organization to bring disability inclusion along, the growing maturity within our own organization. We each have something to learn from that. So I'll start there. I'll hand it back to you, Myles, and
all right.
As somebody that has done a lot more work than I have, and being on the ground, building a referral network, what does it take to get candidates with disabilities to your front door?
So referrals are incredibly important for any kind of human-to-human interaction. So we talk about Disability In from a networking perspective and from a referral perspective because we oftentimes are referring resources onto each other, but the hiring world is built on referrals. In fact, half of all the people that work for peak performers come to us and work for us via referral. So that might be people that are currently working for us, that might be people that are past associates, that might be various different community partners. Shout out to some of the community partners that might be on the call today. Thank you for referring on very valuable people to us. So one of the things that I get asked all the time is how do you actually go about building this? So a lot of times it's important to kind of acknowledge some of the different sources of people out there that are serving the community. So I would give a shout out to vocational rehabilitation. For those of you who are not familiar, that is a oftentimes state and federal run entity that helps people with disabilities either get back into the workplace or get their very first job, oftentimes providing them with accommodations and getting what they need to be successful. We may have some VR counselors that are on the call today. We also are talking about workforce centers. So we are very actively involved with Workforce Solutions Capital Area here in Austin, Texas. And the cool thing is that there's a workforce center in literally every part of the United States. It's all federally funded. It might be a bit more of a drive for you than other places, but there are a lot of these different places that you can go to that help you find pockets of candidates that oftentimes have disabilities that are actively looking for work, but just might not be as visible as other candidates. We also partner regularly with schools, mostly higher education schools, to get people that as they graduate from school, how can we help them find a job, especially if they're a person with a disability, how can we help them find their very first job? And then finally, there's just a host of different nonprofits that are out there that have missions that align with peak performers. So for example, there might be different organizations that help people with substance abuse disorder. Substance abuse, many people don't even realize that is a protected condition under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there's a lot of people that have their lives turned upside down by substance abuse disorder, and they need help getting back on their feet. So they undergo treatment, and then they may need help being able to kind of find their first job. But you might find resources within various different nonprofits that support cancer survivors or people with chronic health conditions. And finally, it's important to kind of acknowledge that oftentimes there's an intersectionality that happens between disability and various different other underserved groups as well too. So for our part, we are actively looking for various different groups that say for example, support Black Americans or Hispanic Americans, and really kind of get them connected with peak performers. So disability is all over the place. It's something that we find really kind of all over the United States and all over within the population. But then I think it's really important that we go and we're out in the community. So as a company, you have a choice. You can either sit in your office and wait for the applicants to come in, or you can go out in the community and you can find people and you can show that you care. And I'm a big fan of the latter option right there, that you show that you care, you're out there in the community, you're working with people, and again, that kind of builds that psychological safety. People know you, they see you, they trust you, and they feel like they can actually submit their resume to you confidently as well. And that builds into actually what I call brand authority. So a lot of it is, Aaron was talking about this a little bit earlier, but how can you project that image within the community that you are a safe and trustworthy employer and a disability inclusive employer? A lot of that goes back to accessibility. A lot of that goes back to your marketing. Like, are you actually featuring people with visible and obvious disabilities and not just the 20-something models that might be appearing in all the stock photos everywhere? But how can you actually picture real people with real disabilities within your images and really kind of make that a prioritization? Cool thing is Disability In actually released a bunch of stock photos that you can download for free and use within your own marketing materials. But then also it's really kind of like going out in the community, talking about why disability matters to you, and then continuing to kind of engage with that population and show them that you care and build that brand authority from the ground up. This is not an easy fix. This is something that Peak Performers works on, and this is basically my full-time job, but it is something that is possible for any business to do.
We kind of talked a little bit about, mindset, so laying a foundation there, and moving into talking about building a referral network to be able to drive some candidates towards you. So how might you advertise? And Myles, what have you found to be effective strategy for advertising jobs, and so that candidates with disabilities specifically feel included in that, or even reached with that type of advertising?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I want to just debunk this myth right away right here is that by and large people with disabilities are not going anywhere special or unique to look for a job. You are going to find them in the general population because, like any other human being, they're going to be first identifying their ability and second off their disability, right? So by and large, I have not found any kind of disability-related job boards to work. I'm not saying that that there isn't potential with any of those things, but I think that can be a nice additional cherry on top to your advertising efforts. But I think that you need to focus on being able to make the process a little bit more inclusive and how to write better job descriptions. So let's talk about that, right? So where are people going? They're going to LinkedIn. They are going to DICE, they're going to Monster, they're going to various different state-funded platforms as well, such as Work in Texas, and they're going to be kind of mixed in with your general applicant pool. And so a lot of how you are handling these people with disabilities, that's going to ultimately be how you find them. In our experience, that's what Peak Performers experiences every single day, is that they are out in the general population. So I think that it's important to kind of go back to the job descriptions, and I often say that there is a devil to be found within the copy paste. So if you find that you are including in every single one of your job descriptions must be able to lift 50 pounds, maybe it's time to reevaluate that and ask yourself, why am I including that, and is that something that could be done by a coworker, especially if it doesn't come up that often. But there's all kinds of other things that come up and sneak up within job descriptions as well, such as the ability to drive a car. I was talking with a gentleman the other day who experienced epilepsy, and he's not able to get to be able to drive a car safely. But why are we excluding him from a job just because he can't drive a car? And the cool thing is that most people with disabilities are already going to know what their limitations are, and they're not going to be applying for these jobs that aren't going to be a good fit anyway. By and large, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be applying for jobs that are a good match for them, kind of exactly where they're at with physical and mental conditions, because they want to be successful, just like any of us would want to be. Can you talk about accessibility within the job application process and how, again, systemically, we may not think about these things, but it's really important that we look at it, that acknowledge it?
Yeah, I think when we think about the kind of the advertising the jobs, and obviously we want to transition that into applying for the job. And most ways businesses handle accepting job applications these days is digital, right? And I want to go back a little bit to there are accessibility considerations to make sure that people with disabilities can navigate that digital job application process. And There's an organization called the Partnership for Employment and Assistive Technology. It's a U.S. Department of Labor funded organization. And they did some research a few years ago with job candidates with disabilities and found that in their most recent experience trying to apply for a job online, 46% found it difficult to impossible to get through the job application process because of accessibility barriers. So we need to be thinking about that. It's one thing to have, well, we've got a ramp to the front door of the building and somebody could drop off the resume. Well, nobody drops off resumes these days, right? Are we making the application process where you drop off your resume and cover letter and go through that process, whatever it happens to be, are we making that accessible? And so a lot of that is digital. And we can and probably will later this year have a whole session around digital accessibility, but just very briefly. So if this is an in-house type process, you're going to want to make sure that the HR team and the IT team that's building that are connected. The HR team is making clear that to make sure that we're getting the best candidates possible, we need to make sure that our front door for job applications is accessible, and then that they set the expectations and the requirements on the IT team to make that accessible. There are various resources that IT team should have, or if they don't, because the HR team's given them the requirements, they will have to get to make sure that the tools that they and the process they build digitally is accessible. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of this stuff is outsourced by an organization to handle the job application process. In which case, your obligation is as a company to make sure that you set the expectations with whomever you hire to do that they will make that accessible. And one of the resources, for instance, Disability In has created for organizations is around how do you do accessible procurement? How do you make sure that what you are buying is going to be accessible? What are some of the things you can put in place to make sure that you're getting something that is not going to charitably saying, inadvertently screen out great candidates with disabilities? Is not only just making sure it's accessible, and you can do the best job possible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every potential candidate with a disability is going to be able to do that. Obviously, you want to drive that 46% down, which is almost half, down to as small as percentage as possible. But there will always be exceptions, or everybody's experience with disability is unique. So make sure that you've got an accommodation statement and mechanism built into that, saying at the end of the day that, hey, I need to request accommodation related to this, and that gets to somebody who can do something about it.
Absolutely. I really like that point, and I think what I would highlight there too is that oftentimes in the disability conversation we hear the D word come up, right? Discrimination, and we hear the B word, bias, right? Or we hear the P word, prejudice. So I think that all those things do exist, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that sometimes things are just built wrong, or processes are built ineffectively, and a lot of times the business might not be doing that on purpose to screen out people with disabilities, but they're still screening out people with disabilities. So this is an important call out that any accessibility person will tell you that no company is perfect, and any HR manager will tell you no company is perfect. We all have room to improve. So I think that kind of going back to that mindset thing, how can we shift our mindset to not only acknowledging kind of like where we want to go, but where do we need to go to get there, and how can we continue to improve over the course of time? Sometimes it will cost money. If you hire a high-grade accessibility person to go through and systematically test all of your systems and make sure that everything works, it's an investment for sure, but it will cost money. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that as well too. So Aaron, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about how we can shift gears and think about restructuring the interview. And I know that you don't interview a whole lot of people right there, but you probably have kind of experienced the interview yourself as a person with a disability. And so what do you think that we can kind of do to be better with the interview process?
I think from my perspective is, I think we, as human beings, have kind of biases, and one of the strongest biases we have is particularly if we're interviewing for a job we know well, we expect to that the best candidate will be the person that most looks like us, sounds like us, talks like us, can do the things exactly as we can do. And I think we go into it with a lot of times unconsciously with a template of that. And the thing about folks with disabilities is they are going to be highly capable, but the way they may do things is going to be different because they may have to do things in a different way than it's always been done. And rather than look at that as well, they don't know how to do the job because they don't do it like I do it, or they don't do it like how everybody has always done it. To turn that around and saying this person has figured out a way to accomplish the same end result, but in a different way. And that really is somebody that has a lot of creativity and a different way of thinking about problems and how to solve that. And in this day and age, when we think about who do we need most as employees, particularly around knowledge work, we need people that are willing to challenge the status quo, to think differently about how to solve a problem, to find better ways to do it, and really lean into innovation and creativity and so forth. And so focus a little bit more on, are you going to be able to get the end results you need? Are they able to produce what needs to be produced as part of the essential job function? And not so much around the trappings of how that has been always done and whether or not they sort of mimic the old way. Because as organizations, we really need people to embrace the new way. And I think people with disabilities are some of the greatest folks at looking at a problem and saying, I can solve that, but it may be in a different way than it's always been done. And that's in a lot of cases going to be a better way to do it.
Yeah, just imagine that you are a person that's a wheelchair user. You are figuring out how to adapt every single day. You're figuring out how to navigate every single day, and oftentimes the world isn't necessarily built for you, but you are overcoming those on a daily basis. And how valuable is that person that you might be able to bring them into your organization to be able to help adapt the organization to pitfalls that come along the way too. But I want to kind of single out a couple of different things that I observe and different challenges that again, going back to kind of like those biases that we have and those assumptions that we're making about people. So when it comes to handshakes, I don't know about you, but I was taught from the very beginning that, you have to have a firm handshake in order to be able to get the job. But, and that seems pretty innocuous. But if you think about people with disabilities, especially if they have a chronic health condition where they're worried about getting a bad bug, or say, for example, they're a person with autism, they may not be comfortable touching you. And so they may skip the handshake, but how can you know that they are still serious about the job and still qualified for the job? It's about thinking about some of the biases that you have against people, but also other things too. It's very common to perceive people that are not making eye contact with you as untrustworthy, or they are people that are not going to, they're trying to pull something over you, or they're not interested in the job. These are all kinds of different rush assumptions that we make about a person, but it's also very common for a person with autism to not be able to make eye contact. For that matter, there's a lot of other things that coincide with this as well. So it might be due to religious differences or cultural differences why
Or they're
somebody
blind,
cannot make eye
right?
contact with you. So it's important to, again, yeah, right. Like, we think about the assumptions that we're making, and how we can really kind of overturn that as well. But I want to talk about a little bit more about creating a welcoming environment where people feel free to kind of bring their entire self in, because this is what it all boils down to is during the interview, we oftentimes have looked at interviews as a series of challenges, a series of hurdles that people must clear. And we oftentimes are pushing candidates in a way that to see how they'll perform under stress. Now, that can be a correct assessment of how well somebody's going to be at doing a job, but that's not necessary for everybody, right? And I think that is much more valuable for organizations to think about how can I be more inclusive and build a welcoming environment where people are able to bring their entire selves and they're going to ask for what they need to be successful, even
Yeah,
during the interview
and
as well. What do you
I'll
think,
just say
Aaron?
that I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but we have had in the past with Disability and a good discussion with some of the folks at the Southwest ADA Center. And I think one of the things that I picked up from there really is when you're thinking about jobs, what are the essential job functions, right? What does it need to get? What does that particular role that you're hiring for need to get done? And a lot of times we kind of throw in extra stuff on top of it, like, well, that job needs to do that, and well, no, maybe the person who has done that role has done those things because they had that, but is that really necessarily what you need to hire for? Do those things even need to be done? So yeah, a great handshake has maybe been considered as a proxy for other qualities and things like that. But um, unless you're in the handshaking business, is that really part of the job, right? Why are you, evaluating somebody based on that when it may not? They may be sitting in a cube for 8 hours straight programming. As long as they can enter text into the computer, as long as they're creative problem solving, can understand what the nature of that job is and perform those functions and produce the output that that job needs. That's really what you want to do. So you're thinking about an interview, not the one size fits all things that are traditionally a proxy for what you thought of as a good candidate, but really focusing in on what does that job need to do? What is the essential part of that? Not the kind of the things that are just layered on that are associated with it, and focusing on can that particular candidate do those essential job functions, and can they do those better or worse than other candidates you have, and thinking along those lines is something that I think is really important as we think about the interview process, not just as a series of you know um, benign hazing type things that just see if they can jump it over all the hurdles you've set up. Sure, some hurdles are important and relevant to that job, and some, probably maybe not. Just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way.
That's right. Just because we have, doesn't mean that it has to be that way in the future. And you have the power to change that. You have the power to change your job descriptions. You have the power to change how you interview. You have the power to change what kind of questions you ask. We think about so many things as being pretty benign, like, hey, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? But that there are certain people with various different neurological differences that question is going to be really hard and really confusing for, and they may not have an answer for you. But why are we rushing to judge that person? I oftentimes like to say too that sometimes, the person that is the most charismatic oftentimes will get the job. But why are we doing that, right? Like if that person is going to be behind the scenes every single day, why do we need the most charismatic person to be able to do that job? And it doesn't have to be that way. You have the power to change this. Absolutely.
I think in the interview process, it occurred to me there's a couple kind of niche things here that, but I think they're important lessons. So, one being on the kind of the low tech side is, and I mentioned earlier the ability to request an accommodation in the application and interview process. Folks that are deaf generally will need
Mhm.
a sign language interpreter to come with them, and then that needs to be provided as accommodation in that. That's not something necessarily every hiring manager or job recruiter is familiar with. Um, but once you're actually in the interview, don't talk to the interpreter. Talk to the candidate. The interviewer, the interpreter is there to help
Yeah.
facilitate the communication. They're not the ones that are applying for a job and that you need to interact with. So, something that comes up time and time again, and I would certainly point people to the EEOC website. It's got a lot of great resources on working with job candidates and employees who are deaf and hard of hearing. On the other end of the spectrum, kind of the high
Yeah.
tech one, and in 2024, I don't think we can get through any sort of webinar where we don't talk about AI. But I bring this up specifically
Yeah.
the folks at Pete I mentioned earlier, before our technical difficulties, the Partnership of Employment and Assistive Technology. They've got some great resources on uh, AI in the workplace. And, you know, for some things, AI can help improve accessibility. But when it comes to using AI to manage job applicants and screening and doing some portion of, or maybe all of the interviews, uh, I think we're still in the point of There are a lot of pitfalls that are potentially there a lot of times because AI, for better or for worse, mimics the way humans have done things, the content and the way we collectively as a society have done things. And, we're not perfect there. So making sure as you go through the hiring process, and if you're choosing to use AI, kind of back to what I talked about before, if this is in-house, you need to be thinking about what the implications are and making sure you're mitigating the risk associated with them if you're going to an outside vendor to do that, to make sure that you're putting those safeguards into the contract and the requirements you give to folks there. So a couple of weeks ago, Pete organized kind of a think tank about AI and the hiring process and how that might align with the AI risk framework that has come from the National Institutes of Standard Technology. And I believe in the next couple of weeks here, they're going to be doing an online dialogue there. So I mean, I've checked out their social media and LinkedIn here and as well as on X/Twitter to be looking at them throwing out some questions in this area and seeing what various folks that are engaging with them have thoughts on this. Um, I think like with AI generally, I don't think we're putting that genie back in the bottle. I don't think we can say AI can and should never be used as part of the application screening and interview process. But how are you making sure that that is a net benefit to the business and including making sure that you're not screening out top talent with disabilities?
I love that. And I love pointing out AI because that kind of goes back to the comment earlier that we have the power to change things now. Artificial intelligence could be used to systematically screen people with disabilities out of the workplace. But we have the power right now to, as this technology is developing, to retrain the computers to be disability neutral and to really try to not screen people out like that. So we really have a lot of power to change things right now. So let's bring it
Yeah,
back home, Aaron.
let's go
Let's
ahead and
let's
wrap
kind
it
of
up.
do our final
And
topic right here.
we talk about how we can educate and
Yeah,
help align stakeholders across the organization. So Miles, I'll
yeah.
toss it to you to share any thoughts on really how we began moving things at an organizational level.
Yeah, at an organizational level, this thing is hard. This is going to take some time. This is going to take a lot of buy-in. This is going to take a lot of conversations. It's worth it, but it does take a lot of time and effort from an organizational level. So I think the first thing that you can do is that you can build a team of very empathetic recruiters and HR folks that are going to help throughout the process, and you're going to engage with them regularly to talk about disability, as well as various different other diversifying factors of the people that you are encountering as well too. Because really the approach to disability hiring is the approach to human hiring. And so if we can create a more human-centric hiring environment, we're going to create a more positive disability hiring-centric environment as well. This is not the kind of atmosphere where we want to, challenge, we want to screen people out. We want to really kind of focus on how can we screen people in and how can we create it as inclusive as possible too. But I think that it's important to look at it as disability hiring is business as usual. Here at Peak Performance, that's something that we have really kind of ingrained into our entire culture. So much to the point that sometimes it's like, oh, we don't even realize that we're working with people with disabilities every single day because we're just working with humans. And that's really where I think a lot of people can kind of take that away is like, how can I kind of shift my mindset to just working with other humans that oftentimes may have needs? And we all have needs, right? You might have the need to go to your cousin's wedding. You may have the need to take some time off to go to the doctor. You may have some particular need to work from home. We all have needs, and just because they're labeled as a disability need doesn't mean that we have to treat them any differently from a how we interact with them perspective too. Now, obviously, there's going to be some different processes in place when it comes to accommodations and things like that. But how can we strip this down and really kind of make it a normal part of doing business? And I would kind of finally shout out as well too that if you are in the audience and you don't know a lot about disability right now and you don't know a lot about accommodations, that's where I would point you towards askjan.org. That's what Peak Performers uses on a pretty regular basis in order to and learn a little bit more because we mentioned it earlier that about the person with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Even two people with the same disability might have completely different needs, and so it's really important to acknowledge that and kind of and continue to learn more and uncover more. There's all kinds of different examples of people with the same disability that may need things entirely differently. But the other kind of cool thing too is you can use this as a resource to learn a little bit more. But then ultimately, you oftentimes can ask the person with the disability themselves, hey, what do you need to be successful? They've been living and working with their disability their entire life. They are the pro at their disability. And so a lot of times you can ask them what they need to be successful, and they're going to be able to come to the table with some solutions for you and at least some recommendations for like, here's how I can be more effective and operate and
Miles,
be
I'd
more
throw in
productive in the
there, in
workplace
addition
too.
to Ask Jan, which is the Job Accommodation Network, there's also EARN, the Employee Assistance and
Mhm.
Resource Network on Disability. So that's askearn.org. So those two, plus the one I mentioned earlier, Partnership on Employment and Assistive Technology, PEAT, PEAT, works, WORKS.org. These are all three U.S. Department of Labor funded resources for employers. They're free and available to help make sure that employers have the information they need to ensuring that they have top have the right talent to fill the needs that they have, and that not to overlook disability as being something that would be hard to do or risky because I think we've talked a lot about this stuff, and I know there may be folks that are like really resonating with these things. I think from our experience at Disability, and there's kind of a couple two. Let's just start two common themes around why people kind of struggle to get started. So one is that's so much. I'm one person. I don't even know where to start. I can't do all that. And what we always say is just you start somewhere. Start in one place. Let's like any big problem. Let's just break it down. Focus on the thing you can control most. Right. Yes, there's other parts of the organization that need to do better on disability inclusion, but you can't do everything all at once, all by yourself. Right. So what is something you can control? What is something that you can do to apply? Today we're talking about certainly the recruiting and hiring process, and as an HR person, as a hiring manager, maybe that is something you have control over. In our subsequent sessions we'll be talking about other things, and maybe that'll resonate more with you, but just start somewhere. The other thing is oh, this sounds kind of risky. I'm not sure we should be doing these sorts of things. What if we do it wrong? Will we look bad? And those sorts of things. And really, the worst is to not do anything, right? If you're coming at it with the right attitude and the goal that you want to do, and that is right, then you're going to be going in the right direction, just by definition. Right now, there are lots of resources out there. We just talked about three websites that the Department of Labor funds, and those are great resources. And then Disability In is a great resource. That's why we exist. Disability In, the national organization, disabilityin.org, has got a lot of great resources. The reason why we're at the local affiliate level here in Central Texas is not that because in and of itself we have all the answers and you just got to come to us and we'll tell you the answers. The real value is in the network, getting together with other people who have all shared a little bit of this and realize, oh, wait a minute, this isn't as big and as scary as I thought, and I can really take that first step and knowing what to do, or learning from others maybe what not to do, and maybe what I can focus on. So yeah, aligning an organization and educating an organization is definitely more than a single person job. Assuming you're not a single person business, um, that is that can be big and scary, but doing it with friends makes it a lot more fun.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Again, this has been Myles and Aaron with Disability in Central Texas. And if you'd like to learn more, we will drop a link in the chat for Disability in Central Texas where you can get involved. Again, join us for monthly events. And by the way, if you happen to be stopping by and you are a job seeker, feel free to connect with me and connect with Peak Performers. Check out all of our jobs there. And if you want to hire somebody with a disability and you're not entirely sure how to do so, Peak Performers is able to help you out with that. Let's schedule some time. Let's chat about that because disability hiring is within your reach. It is something that you can totally do, and Peak Performers is here to help. Aaron, thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for your participation with this as well. We'll go ahead and give it a wrap.